Hello and welcome to another painting demonstration by me, John Silver. In this one I'm going to be showing you how I would paint a portrait, a female portrait, using acrylics on canvas panel. And you can see I've already drawn out the image and I'm just now defining some of the areas, the darker areas, with the black or Payne's grey. That's all I'm using at this initial stage is black or Payne's grey and white, titanium white. What I do use instead of actual titanium white is white gesso. I find it's brighter, it's whiter, and it's certainly far cheaper, and it goes a long way. So anyway, I'm just knocking in a few of these darker areas, putting the darkest darks first. And this way you can slowly build your painting up. Now you see I'm holding the brush quite close to the brush end in order to get this area of detail that I want. Later on I will change and hold it in a more loose fashion when I want to apply more expressive brush strokes. But I just need to get some accuracy here right at the very beginning. It doesn't have to be too accurate. I mean, I like to be quite messy when I start a painting. And in fact, the messier the better, really, at this stage, because when you go over it, those little areas of mess that you've made will actually show through and create a little bit of interest in what would otherwise be dull areas of painting. So every little bit of mess helps. So slowly building it up, bit by bit. This is going to take a little bit of time. In fact, I'm even using some dry brush methods as well. Once the brush has run out of paint, just use the heel of the brush and press the brush into the canvas. But I've just loaded it now and just applying some more darker areas. You can see, just use the heel of the brush. Make little marks and press the brush into the canvas. Little squirt of water and some matte medium now, which I'm going to apply to the whole thing. This just creates a little bit of a ground or a couch to paint into, and it allows me to paint in a more loose style. It is almost like watercolour style, really, cross between watercolour and oil paint, and I'm just applying the paint into that gel medium and just now using a fan brush, which is much larger and I can be much more expressive and loose with this. And it doesn't matter how thin you go with this paint now, because I've applied that gel medium, which will bind the paint molecules together. If you just used water, it would not work. Your molecules of the acrylic paint would not bind together and would just become powdery. So basically just going over the entire painting now with a little fine bit of the grey. It becomes grey the more you move the paint out and spread it around. Add some more dark paint now and building it up again, stage by stage, step by step. You find if you do it this way, eventually everything comes to plan, really, exactly how you meant it to be, or certain little accidents can help you to perhaps swing in another direction and change the painting entirely. You don't know until you start, until you try things and experiment. And I try and experiment in more or less every painting I do. You've got to try things differently, or else you're just going to keep doing the same things, and I like to be different each time. Because that's the only way you learn, is by experimenting. Again, I'm not trying to create any sort of smooth areas like skin, being skin smooth. It's nothing to do with that at the moment. I'm just creating those darker areas and adding more or less textural areas where you can actually see the brush strokes. And that's why I like using a bristle fan brush, because it does create lovely little brush strokes that are visible. Now I've got a little bit of the white gesso, which is, because it's got some of the black paint on the brush, is a little bit grey, and I can make it lighter or darker by how I press the paint in with the brush. So it's mid-tone grey there on the skin. Now, using a little scraper tool, well, it's a silicone tool, and I'm just moving the paint around. While that gel medium is still wet, that matte medium, I can still move this paint around. It stays wet for quite some time without actually being a retarder. It naturally retards the paint and naturally slows it down from drying. And using an ordinary kitchen fork, I can scrape into this while it's still wet. So all those little fine hairs I can approximate with something as simple as a kitchen fork, a dining fork. But use whatever comes to hand that you think is going to make an appropriate mark or something different, to create some interest. I mean, I will be going over these little marks once they're dry, but again, they will show through the different layers. Certain areas will show through, and those little marks will still be visible to a certain extent. Come back to a smaller brush now and just defining those darker areas again where they become a little bit washed out, just to create that contrast. You find that when you're painting like this, doing an underpainting, you need to create more contrast than you think is necessary. So the dark should be darker and the light should be lighter than the actual image that you're going from. So again, just pushing these darker areas roughly, but still accurately to a certain extent, because I don't want to lose that definition I've already got in there. So I'm just augmenting it again with some darks. Again, this can take some time, but there's no rush. No one said you had to do a painting in 10 minutes. You take as long as you want, as long as necessary, over a painting, until you think it's of the required level that you want. So I'll keep going over areas like this until I'm satisfied with the appearance. Now, on the same brush, I've now added some more white now and starting to add those highlights back in to give it more of a three-dimensional appearance now. So you pay very close attention to where the lightest lights are. I do find that this part of a painting is probably the most enjoyable part for me. I absolutely love doing the underpaintings. Yeah, I enjoy doing the colour as well, but maybe perhaps I should just leave them at the underpainting stage in my paintings and just have monochromatic paintings. There's nothing to stop you doing that. It's still a painting at the end of the day. It's still your painting and you decide how you want it to look. So we're going with a little bit more stark white now to really define those areas that are going to catch the light and stand out. And each of these layers, subsequent layers, are also building up texture, which is needed in a lot of paintings. The brush marks themselves are wonderful to behold if you get them right. Of course, Rembrandt was an absolute master at this. His brushstroke work was amazing. The older he got, the better it became. In my opinion. I much prefer his later work than his work when he was very young. When he was very young, he tended to go into extreme detail and realism, and as he got older, he became much more expressive, making one brushstroke do what normally would have taken 50 brushstrokes. Now you can see I've got the fork out again and just applying one or two little scratches and scrapes, and I'm using a smaller fan brush now because I just need to get a little bit more control in certain areas, so it doesn't have to be a large fan brush. Again, it's a bristle brush. I'm just defining the background now, where I want these the highlights to be. It's going to be quite a light background to throw the figure out, the portrait out. Just wisping in a few little areas. It's almost like dry brushwork at times, using the dry brush technique. I just need to highlight that edge of the face to make it look a little bit more symmetrical. Faces should be generally symmetrical. And while it's wet, get the old fork out again and add some more scratches and scrapes. This produces really nice texture as well at this stage, because that white paint is quite thick. Back with the darks again, establishing the darks. I'm still not quite happy with the hair, and that will change. It will all alter bit by bit. I need some hair dropping down over the eye there as well. It is very lovely to paint in this expressive way. And if you haven't ever done it, I urge you to give it a try. You'll find it so enjoyable and very freeing. It gives you a sense of great liberty to do whatever you wish with a brush, and not slavishly copying something, but rather becoming inventive with a fork or with big brushes or whatever, your fingers, and just be expressive and inventive. You see, I'm going back over the highlights again now, because with acrylic paint you do find that as it dries, the white tends to soak in and blend in a little bit more and go a little bit duller, more dull. So you have to keep applying the white, building it up in order to get those contrasts, to get it whiter than it should be, than it appears as it dries. But the more layers you do, the whiter it will become. So it's still all about building up the form of the face, making sure that you've got the planes right, where the light catches different planes of the face and the features. Not trying to get photorealism on the face at all, but it still needs to look relatively attractive, really, and human. I always pay particular attention and care around the lips, the end of the nose and the eyes. They're the places that need to have the most detail and to be the most realistic and accurate in order for the portrait to look good. Those three areas are the key areas. Everything else can really just fade and blend into whatever, but the eyes, the nose and the mouth are the most important part of any portrait. If you want it to look like the person you're painting, they have to be extremely accurate. Even the slightest little millimetre out of an eye, and it won't look like that person. It has to be that accurate when you're doing a portrait of a person. So bear that in mind when you're doing a portrait. The eyes, the nose, the mouth. Make sure they are absolutely 100% accurate. And then everything else you can have fun with and just play around. Of course, there are other styles of portraiture where the accuracy is not at all involved, and it's all about getting the feeling and the character of the person. So, there are many ways of doing a portrait, just like there are in doing a landscape or anything else. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to you and your style and what you want the painting to look like. It doesn't have to look like anybody else's painting. It's got to be yours. Okay, here I'm just adding a few little details, a few dots on this black area. This is a lace, delicate decorative lace collar, frilly collar. So I'm just applying a few little dots where the light is shining through that lace pattern work. It's not accurate, it's just an approximation of what I see, as if you would look at something with half closed eyes. And again, that will build up the more I get into doing this, and I will define the darks again later on around that collar. Because that is an area of detail I really quite like. I'm attracted to that, so I want to put a little bit more work into that in detail. And while I've got some light paint on that fine brush, I will add a few more highlights and delicate touches. And it's starting to look a little bit more realistic, those areas. You have to look extremely closely at things like the nostrils when you're painting in this style. Every tiny, tiny little mark can mean something. Again, building up those lights, making them lighter again. You can see how the others, it's sunk in since the last time I did it, but now it's starting to look brighter. But all those previous layers are still showing through, and as I said before, they create such great interest. Here I go with the fork again. I also find it a very, very useful tool just for moving paint around sometimes, rather than a brush. So that edge of the neck will actually blend out into the background a little bit more, so I'm not trying to define it too much. Adding a little bit of interest to the dress, just with a few broad strokes and then scratches with the fork. Now with the fine brush, I'm using the darks now to accent this decorative lace collar. It's frilly lace. It's all made up. You see, if you put too much attention to detail in this area, your eye is going to be drawn down there instead of onto the face of the portrait, which is always a danger if you start putting details somewhere else. So I don't think I'm going to be doing too much more to that lace collar. But it does give something from which the neck can protrude and emerge from, which is vitally important unless you're painting a complete nude, of course. Now with that thin rigger brush, I'm just adding one or two little straggly lines here and there, just as straggly pieces of hair, but all sorts of different variations with the brush, just flipping it around, not trying to be uniform with it at all, but messy. Now the hair coming over this eye I think is quite attractive, so I need to accent that and make it look a little bit more so. Exaggerating it almost. There's usually stray hairs going everywhere on a portrait. No one has perfect plastic hair. So you have to incorporate it. No, you don't have to, but I like to incorporate the randomness and the messiness that can occur with the odd stray hair. It shows that we are not all perfect. In fact, the human body is a mass of imperfections. That's what makes us all so different. And I do love highlighting those imperfections, like I said earlier about messy, straggly hair. It's so much more interesting to paint than well-groomed hair, which to me is quite boring. And whenever necessary, use a hairdryer just to dry everything off if you need to do some paint over the top. So now another spray of water, and this time I'm adding some gloss medium. I'm going to paint entirely over this with gloss medium, because this is going to be the final colour layer. Now I've got the background completely done. I'm adding a nice thick layer of this, which will slow the drying down of the paint, which will enable me to move the paint around a little bit more. But also I'll be applying glazes, which is thin areas of colour. So using transparent paints very thinly, just to go over little areas where I think that colour needs to be. This is a burnt sienna, a transparent burnt sienna, or a transparent red oxide, very thin. And now with little bit of cadmium orange and white, I can start to add in a few more of those little more slightly solid colours, and getting redder and redder just by adding some cadmium red into the mix here and there. I don't want to put this everywhere because red's a very dominant colour and just needs to be a highlight colour. So I'll only do a little bit now. I'm going into almost with yellow ochre and white, and perhaps a tiny touch of cadmium orange. You can get a very pale skin colour. And this is a very pale person portrait, so that's the dominant colour I'll be using. A bit thicker now, this paint, it's not quite so thin. And now adding a mid-tone over some of those darker areas. But because it's a semi-transparent paint I'm using, those dark areas and all those scratches I put in earlier on and fine marks are all starting to, well, will all keep showing through and be visible very, very subtly. I love that. I love that approach. The messiness, and you slowly build in the detail where you want it to be. So I'm just adding some lighter areas in the background, highlights where I want the light areas to be in order to accent the outline of the hair. It's not hard edges, they're not hard edges at all. I'm using this silicone tool again just to move the paint around a bit, blend it here and there, then back to the brush. This underlying layer, because of the gloss gel medium I've put on, is still quite wet, and you can move it around still. It will stay wet for quite some time without adding any gel retarders or anything. Now then, I'm going to add a few more grey blue touches, which are the cooler areas. And again, I'm sort of slightly exaggerating the coolness of these, but I will be going over the top of them as well with flesh colour here and there. But parts of those blue areas will still show through. And wherever you put a colour like this blue, you must also add it to other areas of the painting. Not a great deal, but just here and there, to harmonise and balance the painting out. So a little bit there, perhaps a bit lighter, and just wherever I feel it is necessary to balance the painting. Use the handle of the brush sometimes instead of a fork, just to move the paint around. Using a fan brush here just to blend some of that paint together. I don't normally do this, don't normally blend, but this just calls for it in certain areas. Now a little bit of purple now, just a slight bit of purple, just to create a little bit of warmth into those cooler areas. We'll add a bit of purple into those lips as well. It's slowly beginning to take shape as a coloured painting. All these little bits, little dashes of paint here and there are all combining to create the whole. Getting a bit more picky now about where I place a brush stroke. As you reach the finer stages, or the final stages of a painting, you have to pay particular care and attention to each brush stroke you make. In the beginning it's nice to be messy and loose, but the more you get to the end of the painting, the more careful you must be with your brush strokes. Unless you're after a different feeling altogether, an expressive feeling. That's a different approach entirely. So I'm just adding some little dashes of colour, a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with white. And now a little bit of burnt sienna added to that, just to create a slight flesh tone, and also I'm putting some colour in the eyes there. Black again on the brush, just to define those darker areas which have become slightly lighter. So I'm tending to use a smaller brush at the moment. And you will find as you get towards the end or the final stages of a painting, you will use smaller and smaller brushes, or I do in the particular style I was painting this painting in. So I need to balance this mouth up, make sure it's all correct. Careful study, and the same with the nose. Use your fingers to move the paint around and blend it. If it becomes too bright, just quickly blot it out with your finger. Make it less stark. Very useful tools, fingers, as you can tell by mine, covered in paint. But that's what artists are, aren't they? They're humans covered in paint. A few little highlights and dashes, dots and dashes. And we are coming to the final stages of the painting. So we're getting slightly warmer now. A few little areas of a warmer red and orange. And the nose is quite a warm area, so there'll be a little bit of orange in there. Little attention to little details now, and that's more or less the final painting. I hope you enjoyed this painting and watching me do this painting, and I hope you'll have a go at something like this yourself. If you have any questions or comments, anything that I can help you with, I will be only too pleased to do my best to help and advise. So I hope you like this, and I hope you will join me on my next painting video. And in the meantime, I want you to all have a wonderful day's painting.